"Don't send me back to them," begged the orc girl, chained at the village auction. A farmer tore her away and fled at full gallop. What he didn't know yet was who he had truly just saved, and that it would change his fate forever. There are three kinds of silence in a village square. The silence before the auction cry, when everyone pretends not to want what they came to buy. The silence after the blow, when someone is struck and the crowd hesitates between watching and looking away. And the silence of a child who has learned that screaming doesn't help. Torrin Hale knew all three, but it was the third one that stayed in the bones. The morning in Durnhollow had arrived with the smell of wet wood and sour flour. The previous night's rain still dripped from the thatched rooftops, and the mud of the main square clung to boots like the ground didn't want anyone to leave. Torrin tied his horse to the post near the tavern. 2 sacks of grain hung from either side of the saddle. Wheat he had spent 3 days sacking, counting grain by grain, after the river flood ruined half the harvest. He would trade it for salt, for oil, and for a new roll of rope, nothing more. He didn't have money for anything more. The square was too crowded for a midweek morning. Peasants argued about flour prices near the miller's stall. Fishermen displayed salted trout on dark wooden boards. Children ran between the legs of adults. In the centre of it all, a rough wooden platform had been set up in front of old Ossen's tavern. Torrin almost didn't look at it, but the auctioneer's cry arrived before any other sound. "Strong creature, good for heavy work. Opening bid, 30 silver coins." Torrin stopped. On the platform, standing between 2 guards with spears, was a young orc girl, too small for what was happening. Her pale green skin was covered in dust and old scratch marks. Her wrists, thin as twigs, held chains that sounded too heavy for a body that size. Her eyes were golden, too large for that small face, and they were looking at the crowd the same way an animal looks at a pen. The girl pulled at the chain. The guard struck her with the shaft of his spear. She fell. The crowd didn't step back. Some laughed. Others simply waited. Torrin felt something tighten in his chest. It wasn't anger yet. It was something closer to nausea. He knew that expression. He had seen it on his own father's face the day they were driven from Lord Aldrich's farm for failing to pay the lease. The face of someone who had asked and no longer expected to receive. Then the girl murmured, not loudly, almost only to herself, but Torrin was close enough to hear, "Don't send me back to them." He stood still for a moment. He calculated what he had. 2 grain sacks. Not even 30 silver coins if he sold everything. Without salt, without oil, without rope, the winter would be harder than expected. He calculated again, reached the same answer. The auctioneer announced the second bid. Someone in the crowd raised a hand with a smile that Torrin didn't like seeing. It was then that the girl's chain loosened for a second. A guard's carelessness as he turned to shoo away a dog that had wandered onto the platform. She ran. The square erupted in shouts. "Catch her!" Torrin didn't think. When she came scraping past the side of the platform, he bent down, grabbed her around the middle and lifted her from the ground in one movement. She was light as a child who hadn't eaten well in days. He put her in front of the saddle. "Hold on tight." She grabbed his tunic with both hands. "Don't send me back to them," she said again, with a firmer voice this time, as if collecting on a promise he hadn't yet made. Torrin kicked the horse. The animal bolted. An arrow cut the air and tore through Torrin's left shoulder. The pain arrived half a second later, like fire that's slow to catch. The grain sacks fell from the saddle. The wheat scattered across the mud. Torrin didn't stop. Nobody teaches you what to do when the most costly decision you've ever made happens in less than 10 seconds. The horse knew the way back. That was good, because Torrin could barely hold the reins. The wound on his shoulder wasn't deep. The arrow had torn more fabric than flesh, but it bled generously, and the horse's constant movement wasn't helping. He held the reins with his right hand and kept the left arm pressed against his body, stiff as a dry branch. The orc girl sat in front of him on the saddle, hands still gripped on his tunic. She said nothing during the entire ride. When they entered the woodland trails and the shouts from the square had grown distant enough to seem part of another world, Torrin let the horse slow its pace. His breathing was short, more from shock than pain. "You're bleeding," she said. "I know. A lot. I know that too." She turned slightly in the saddle to look at him. Her golden eyes were dry. No tears, but there was something in them that Torrin couldn't name right away. It wasn't gratitude yet. It was closer to the expression of someone who has just seen something they hadn't expected to exist. "Why did you do that?" she asked. Torrin took a moment to answer, not because he didn't know, but because the answer seemed too small for everything that had just happened. "A child is a child," he said. She didn't respond, turned her face forward again, and they rode in silence for the rest of the way. Torrin's farm sat 1/2 mile from the village, wedged between 2 low hills covered in old oaks. It was small, smaller even than it had seemed when he inherited it from his father 3 years before. A stone house with a thatched roof, a barn that leaned slightly to one side, a well with a rusted pulley, a field that yielded more stones than wheat in most years. But it was his. When they dismounted, the sun was already low, and the field had that weary gold of late afternoon. Torrin tied the horse to the barn post and sat on a stump near the well. His arm throbbed. "What's your name?" he asked. "Kalir." "Torrin." She looked around. At the house, at the crooked barn, at the empty field. "You live here alone?" It wasn't a question. "Since my father died," he said. 3 years ago." Kalir didn't respond. She went to the herbs growing near the well wall. Small plants with dark leaves that Torrin had never paid attention to. She chose a few, crushed them between her palms, and came back to him. "Can I see the wound?" Torrin lowered his shoulder. She moved the torn fabric aside carefully and pressed the crushed herbs directly against the open flesh. It burned. He swallowed air between his teeth. "My mother taught me," she said. Torrin didn't ask where her mother was. From the way her voice had come out, smooth and without emotion, he understood it was a story she wouldn't tell that night. Sometimes another person's silence is a door you learn not to knock on. She tied a cloth around his shoulder with a knot he didn't know how to make. They sat on the stump as the sky darkened. "What happens now?" she asked. Torrin looked at the nearly empty barn, at where the grain sacks should have been. "Now we figure it out. There are things a very small house teaches that a large one never can. For instance, that 2 people can share silence in very different ways." Kalir slept that first night wrapped in the old blanket Torrin used for the horse, not because he was careless, but because it was the only one without large holes. She didn't complain. Torrin woke before sunrise with his shoulder throbbing and his stomach empty. The last meal he'd had was a piece of hard bread the previous morning before setting out for the village. He sat on the edge of the cot and stared at the narrow window. Outside it was dark and cold. Inside it was cold too, but at least it didn't blow. Kalir was awake. He realized it when she shifted in the corner of the room. "You didn't sleep," he said. "I slept a little." Kalir. Silence. "Not much," she admitted. He didn't ask why. He figured that after time chained to a platform, any ceiling felt strange. In the morning he took stock of what he had, 1/2 a sack of small grain left over from the last harvest, a jar of oil almost gone, salt enough for a week, a piece of smoked pork fat hanging from the roof beam, 3 eggs. It was little for 1 man. For 2, it was a matter of arithmetic. Kalir looked at the inventory with her arms crossed. "I can help," she said. "You don't have to. I'm not talking about having to. I'm talking about helping." Torrin looked at her for a moment. She had the firm voice of someone who doesn't like to depend. "Do you know how to work the land? I know how to do other things." "Like what?" She went to the small garden outside the house. She stayed there a long while, crouching, touching the soil, smelling leaves, examining the herbs growing near the fence. Then she came back. "I know these plants. I know which ones are for healing and which for seasoning. I know how to make broths that fill more than they look, and I know how to find mushrooms in the woods without picking the wrong ones." Torrin considered. "The wrong ones are the ones with the purple-spotted cap." "Those are the ones with the purple-spotted cap," she confirmed, "and the ones that smell like honey but aren't." He gave a small nod. It was a way of agreeing that didn't need words. They spent the day working slowly, Torrin with his left arm limited, using the hoe with only his right. Kalia carrying water from the well in 2 buckets at once, with an ease he hadn't expected from that small body. In the afternoon, she made a broth with the herbs, the mushrooms she'd gathered in the woods, and a pork bone Torrin had saved for grease. The smell that came from the pot was warm and thick, different from what he was used to cooking. He tasted it, said nothing, ate 3 bowls. She noticed and almost smiled, but didn't quite smile for real. That night, Torrin fixed a floorboard that had creaked for months. The sound of the hammer echoed through the small house while the wind beat outside. Kayla sat near the fire, watching the flames. "How long have you lived here?" she asked. "I was born here. Left once when I was 15 to work in Goldport. Came back when my father got sick. And never left again. Never left again." She was quiet for a time. Then, "I've never stayed in one place very long either." Torrin drove another nail. The floorboard stopped creaking. "Sometimes staying in a place is harder than leaving," he said. She didn't respond, but she looked at the fire with a different expression, as if the sentence had landed on her without warning. "Poverty has a rhythm. It isn't the rhythm of despair. That belongs to those who are still falling. It's the rhythm of those who have already reached the bottom and begun searching for stones to step on." The following days were made of work. Torrin knew that without the grain sacks the winter would tighten sooner. The previous week's rain had already flooded the north garden bed, and the little wheat left in the barn wouldn't last past the next month. He needed a solution that cost no silver. Kalia woke before him. Every morning, when Torrin opened his eyes, the fire was already lit, and something was warming in the pot. Sometimes a thin broth, sometimes grain porridge with herbs, never abundant but always hot. He never asked how she knew how to light a fire with that damp wood that he himself found difficult to catch. She never explained. On the 4th day, Torrin decided to go speak with the blacksmith Edrin, who lived 2 miles down the road. Edrin was a man of few words and many debts, but he had a fair deal, tools repaired in exchange for days of work at the forge. "I need a new hoe and a pair of anchor nails for the barn," said Torrin. "That's 3 days at the bellows," Edrin answered, without looking up from the anvil. 2, 2.5. You show up tomorrow morning." Torrin went home with the deal sealed by a handshake. Kalia was in the garden. She had built a small fence of branches around the younger herbs to protect them from the wind. "Did you go to the village?" she asked without looking up. "No, to Edrin's forge." She was still. Torrin noticed the tension in her shoulders. "I didn't mention anything," he said. "About you." She dropped the branch she was holding, looked at the small fence she was building. "It's just that when people know there's an orc somewhere," she started. "I know," Torrin interrupted calmly. She nodded, nothing more. That afternoon, while Torrin mended the old leather of the horse's saddle pad, Kyla sat on the other side of the table and began braiding ropes with strips of rushes she had gathered at the stream bank. They worked in silence, but it was a different silence from the first day, easier to carry. "You had family," she said suddenly. It wasn't a question. "My father," said Torrin. "My mother left when I was small. I don't know where. Never found out." Kalia braided another knot, pulled it firm. "My mother died when I had 6 winters," she said. "In a battle she shouldn't have entered. I'm sorry." "You don't have to be." She paused. "But thank you all the same." The fire crackled. Outside, the wind bent the tops of the oaks. "Why were you at that auction?" Torrin finally asked. Kalia took a moment. Her hands kept braiding. "I ran," she said simply. "From who?" "From a place where everyone expected me to be someone I didn't want to be." Torrin didn't ask further. He knew that feeling. It had something to do with Lord Aldrich's farm, with Goldport, with every time someone looked at him and saw only the poor tenant's son. Sometimes running is the only way to stop disappearing from the inside. That night, Kayla baked 2 thin flatbreads on the hearthstone. They were hard and uneven. Torrin ate his entire portion and said nothing unkind. She didn't smile, but she pushed the empty bowl aside with the particular satisfaction of someone who made something with their own hands and watched it work. The fever didn't arrive all at once. It arrived the way most bad things do. First, a tiredness that seems normal, then a heat that doesn't match the temperature of the air, and finally the clarity that something is wrong and can no longer be ignored. On the morning of the 8th day, Torrin couldn't get up. His arms were heavy as stone, his forehead burned, and when he tried to sit, the room turned slowly, like a water wheel someone had pushed by accident. Kayla was at the doorway when he half fainted. She caught him before his head hit the floor. "It didn't go deep," she murmured, as she helped him back to the cot. "But it's staying." He tried to answer. Only a rough sound came out. She spent the entire day without leaving the house. She made willow bark tea for the fever, changed the shoulder dressing, which had grown slightly infected, with different herbs than the first ones, sharper in smell, stronger in effect. She wetted a cloth at the well and placed it on his forehead when the heat rose too high. Torrin slept and woke in uneven intervals. When he woke, she was always nearby, sometimes standing by the narrow window, sometimes sitting in the chair beside the cot, working her rush knots in the dark, with the calm of someone who has done it for years. On the second night of fever, he woke with cold. She was folding a cloth at the edge of the table. "Kayla," he called. His voice came out hoarse. "I'm here. Why haven't you left?" She stopped with the cloth in her hands. She didn't answer right away. "You didn't leave when you could have turned away," she said. At the square, silence. "That doesn't give me any debt to you," she continued, "but it gives me reason to stay." Torrin didn't respond. Not because there was nothing to say, but because he was too weak to turn into words what that had meant. He closed his eyes. She placed another blanket over him. On the 3rd night, the fever broke. Torrin woke in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, but with a clear head for the first time in days. The fire was low, but alive. Outside it was raining. Kayla was sleeping in the chair with her head resting on her arm. Her face in that position looked younger than during her waking hours, less guarded. Torrin looked at her for a moment. He thought about what he had lost that day at the square, the grain sacks, the harder winter ahead, the knife the auctioneer had ordered a guard to fetch before they got too far, and he thought about what he had gained. He didn't know what to call it yet, but it was something. He reached for the water jug on the floor, drank, and went back to sleep. The rain continued. The fire continued. Kayla continued. There is a different sound in a guard dog's bark. It isn't the bark of an animal that found a rabbit or is playing with its own shadow. It's shorter, drier, the sound of something that is genuinely warning. Torrin woke to that sound. It was late, nearly midnight, by the look of the moon. The fire had almost died. Kayla was already standing at the narrow window, looking out with tense shoulders. "You heard it too," he said. "Yes." "How many?" "I don't know yet. Shadows between the oaks." Torrin grabbed the axe kept behind the door. Kayla didn't move from the window. "Do you know anyone who would come here at night?" she asked. "No one I'd want to receive." He lit the torch and opened the door. The night air was cold and damp. The dog, tied at the barn, was barking with its hackles raised toward the woods. At the edge of the trees, 5 tall and silent shapes waited, too large to be peasants, armed. Torrin gripped the axe with both hands. Kayla came out behind him. She saw the shapes and stopped. A change moved across her face. It wasn't fear. It was something more complicated, the face of someone who recognizes something they were expecting, but hadn't wanted to arrive just yet. "They are from my people," she said. The leader stepped into the torchlight. He was enormous, nearly 2 heads taller than Torrin, dark green skin, battle scars on his face and arms, a long spear on his back, but hands open, A sign he hadn't come to fight, at least not yet. "So we have found you, little Kalir." His voice was as deep as old timber. Torren didn't lower the axe. "Who are you?" The orc looked at him with an expression Torren couldn't read immediately. After a second, he understood it. Surprise. The warrior hadn't expected a human to stand between him and the girl. "Warriors of Clan Varrock," said the leader, "and you do not know who has shared your roof, human." He pointed at Kalia. "This child is the daughter of Queen Zaka, lady of Clan Varrock, from the Iron Fields to the Northern Mountains." Torren stood motionless. His mind processed the words slowly. "Queen." Kayla lowered her eyes, not in shame, in something more like weight. "I ran," she said, with the same flat voice she used when she didn't want emotion to escape. "I didn't want to live among wars." The leader looked at her for a long moment, then at Torren. "You protected her, and you are wounded because of it." It wasn't an accusation, but it wasn't praise either. It was simply the observation of someone who measures everything with precision. "Yes," Torren answered. "Then come. The Queen wishes to see you." Torren looked at Kalir. She looked back. "He needs it," she said simply, pointing to his shoulder, which had begun to throb again under the effort of the night. "The healers of my clan do more than field herbs." The leader nodded as if the matter were settled. Torren looked one last time at the small house, at the fire still breathing inside, at the crooked barn. Then he tied his horse and followed. There are places that change in size as you learn to see them. Torren's house seemed smaller every year. The Varrock Valley seemed larger with every hour he spent inside it. The ride took 2 days. Torren's shoulder held on, barely, because Kalir changed the dressing both nights and made him drink a bitter tea she prepared from leaves gathered along the way. He drank without complaining. She noticed this, but said nothing. The orc warriors rode in silence. They weren't hostile, just economical, like people who see no point in spending words where silence does the job. Torren learned not to fill that silence. When they reached the valley, the sun was low and the camp torches already burned at the edge of the field. Dark leather tents, enormous, set up in organized rows like an army that knows it's staying. Low campfires, the smell of roasting meat and pine wood, and at the center of it all, a tent larger than the others. Kalir dismounted before the horse had fully stopped. A figure emerged from the central tent. Torren saw her and went quiet. Zaka, queen of Clan Varrock, stood nearly a head and a half above him. Her warrior's body, built by years of battle, moved with a precision that wasn't aggressive. It was simply complete, like something with nothing excessive and nothing missing. Deep green skin, almost the dark green of leaves after rain. Long black hair in battle braids that fell over her shoulder. Golden eyes, the same as Kalir's, but with more time and more weight in them. When she saw her daughter, the world around her seemed to stop. Kalir ran. Zaka received her with open arms and held her with the strength of a mother who had spent many sleepless nights. No words, just the embrace. Torren stood with his cap in his hands, not quite knowing what to do with his own body. After a long moment, Zaka released her daughter and looked at him. Her gaze was as direct as a pointed knife, not threatening but with no intention whatsoever of turning away. "Is this the human?" she asked. "It is," said Kalir. Zaka walked toward Torren, stopped to step away. She looked at his poorly healed shoulder, his calloused hands, his simple clothing mended in 2 places. "You faced armed men to save a child who was not of your people. It wasn't a question." "A child is a child," he said. It was the same answer he had given Kalir, the only true one. Something changed in Zaka's gaze. It wasn't gratitude yet. It was closer to what Torren had felt when he watched Kalir building the little branch fence in the garden, the surprise of seeing someone do something small with genuine care. "The healers will tend to your shoulder," she said. "You'll stay here tonight." In the days that followed, Torren stayed, not out of obligation, because his shoulder genuinely needed it. and because Clan Varrock, which he had imagined as savage warriors, was a community of people who worked, cooked, repaired tools, and argued about harvests like any human village. Zaka came to speak with him in the afternoons. At first, short conversations about the farm, about Durnhollow, about how human trade worked in the border villages. Then they grew longer. She asked with precision, listened with complete attention, answered with an honesty that dispensed with detours. Torrin had never spoken so much with anyone in years. "You're not afraid of me," she said one afternoon, while sharpening a knife near the campfire. "I see no reason to be. Most humans would have fled on the first night. Most humans have never had a young orc girl changing their dressing at 3 a.m. She stopped sharpening the knife. She looked at him, and for a second, Torrin saw something different in that face, built not to show weakness, something that looked very much like the expression of someone who has just recognized a mirror where they didn't expect to find one. A bond has a price that no one charges you right away. They charge you later, when you're already too committed to step back. On the 5th day in the Varrock Valley, the riders from Durnhollow arrived. There were 6 of them, with the insignia of the village council and the expressions of men who had come to collect something and had no intention of leaving empty-handed. Their leader was Morris, the justice of the peace from Durnhollow, a short and broad man with a loud voice and small thoughts. "Oh, we've come for the man," said Morris to the warrior guarding the valley entrance. "Torrin Hale. He stole goods from a lawful auction and wounded 2 guards in the flight." Zaka received them in the open field, standing before the tents. No weapons in her hands, but 6 warriors on either side. Torrin stood beside her, Kayla behind. Morris looked at the scene, swallowed, but didn't retreat. "We demand the man be handed over to the Durnhollow Council for judgment." Zaka looked at Morris the way someone looks at a small fire, with enough attention to know it isn't dangerous. "You held an auction for a child," she said. Her voice was calm. The calm of someone who doesn't need to shout to be heard. A free child who fled from a captivity that was never lawful. The creature was captured at the borders of the child has a name," Zaka interrupted, "and she is my daughter." The silence that followed had texture. Morris went pale. "The man you call a thief," continued Zaka, "did what none of the many who stood in that square had the courage to do. He was the only one who acted like someone who understands what is right. The law of Durnhollow does not reach this valley," she said simply. Inside Varrock's war council that same day, there was debate. Old warrior Breck, who had more scars than Torrin had years of life, raised his voice. "Protecting a human against human law may bring war, Queen." "It may," she admitted. "He is not of our clan." "Not yet," she said. Silence in the council. Torrin was outside the tent. He hadn't been called in. It was a clan matter, not his, but the words arrived all the same. Kayla was sitting on the ground beside him. "Do you know what she just did?" he asked quietly. "Yes. It could bring serious trouble to the clan." "I know." He stared at the flames of one of the distant campfires. "I didn't ask her to do that." "She didn't do it because you asked," said Kayla. "She did it because it is what she believes." Torrin didn't respond. After a long moment he said, "Your mother is a difficult woman to understand." Kayla looked at him with that almost smile he had learned to recognize. "She says the same about you. Family is not what you inherit. It is what you choose not to let go of when you could have walked away." On the 10th day, Torrin went to Zaka and said he would be going back to the farm. She was mending a strip of armor leather with a thick needle and waxed thread. She didn't look up when he arrived. "When?" she asked. "Tomorrow morning." Silence. "The barn needs a new beam. The fence on the north garden is falling. And if I don't plant before the first frosts, I won't have a harvest next year." Zaka kept sewing. "Those are good reasons to go back," she said. "They're the only ones I have." She stopped. set the armor down on the bench beside her and looked at him for the first time in the conversation. Would you return if you had other reasons? Torrin sat with the question for a moment. It was a small question, but it wasn't simple. Yes, he said. Something in her face changed very slightly, the kind of change you only see if you're paying close attention. Then take what you need for the barn. The clan's woodcutter will send the beam with one of the warriors. He opened his mouth to say he didn't need it, closed it without saying anything. Sometimes accepting help is the only honest answer. Kalia found him near the camp well that afternoon. She was holding a bundle of herbs tied with cord, the kind of stock that lasts months, organized with the care of someone who spent time learning what each plant does. For you, she said, for the winter. Torrin took the bundle. Kalia, thank you, for everything you did when I had the fever. She was quiet for a second. You took me off a chain, she said. I took you out of a fever. We're even. Torrin almost said it wasn't quite like that what she had done was more than that. But he understood that for her, that was her way of saying she was all right, that she was whole. That what had happened between them in those past days hadn't been gratitude, it had been choice. He nodded. The next morning the Varrock Valley woke early. The warrior woodcutter strapped the oak beam to Torrin's horse. 2 other warriors confirmed they would ride with him to the road. Zarka was standing at the entrance to the camp when he mounted. Neither of them said much. Sometimes the right farewell needs no words. Your farm is 1/2 a mile from Durnhollow, she said at last. Yes. The Varrock Road passes 2 miles north of your field. Torrin held the reins. Good to know, he said. She didn't respond, but there was something in that gaze that Torrin carried with him the entire way back. The same thing Kalia had carried the morning he found her lighting the fire in his kitchen, the certainty that something had changed permanently, that somewhere in that piece of the world someone had chosen to stay. 3 months later, the barn beam was firm. The north garden bed had grown beyond what Torrin expected, and in the afternoons, when the wind came from the north, there was a different smell in the air. Cured leather, pine and herbs he didn't know how to name. It was the smell of the Varrock Road. Kalia appeared first one afternoon in October, with a basket of roots the clan had harvested in excess. She traded it for the honey Torrin had taken from the fence hives. Neither of them called it a visit, but it happened again 2 weeks later. And then, once more. Zarka came on the 4th time. She stood at the doorway looking into the small house like someone measuring whether there was room. There is, said Torrin, without her having asked anything. She came inside. Kalia made the broth. Torrin brought the bread. Zarka sat near the fire she herself had helped build up with 2 logs she'd brought tied to her saddle. And that night, in a small and crooked house near a leaning barn, they ate together for the first time. Not because blood commanded it, not because the law permitted it, but because 3 people chose to sit at the same fire. And that, in the end, was enough. A name is given, a wound is earned, but a home is only real when someone chooses to come back to it.